Thank you all for coming out. It's really wonderful to see a full room, a full house starting off the new year. And this is our first of the institute-wide generative theme initiatives. I'll say a little bit about that in a second. We first want to welcome all of you. We'll have a few more people coming in, I'm sure, before too long. Want to thank many people. Thanks to Chloe for all the behind the scenes work and ordering the sandwiches and feeding you all. Thanks to our tech team in the International Institute, Kaya, Ryan, and Andre, who organized the flyer and the website, and will be posting today's video. Thanks to Oliver, Warren, and Mai for creating a video today. We didn't do the event, we chose not to do the event hybrid, but we will have a recording and it will be posted online. So if you like what you hear, tell your friends. Thanks to Peggy for our communications director who will be writing about this. And always thanks to Catherine and Ron, who are the backbone of so many things in the Institute. And Cindy Fan, our fearless leader, is traveling now. She's the vice provost of the International Institute. David Kim and I are the associate vice provost, and we are here to welcome you and organize this event. We'd like to take a minute to acknowledge the land we are on, the unceded land of the Gabrielino and Tongan people. Now UCLA is a land grant institution, which as AI informed me this morning, because I had to Google, what exactly is a land grant institution? I've been saying it all these years and I didn't really know what it was. So AI informed me that land grant universities were established under the Morrill Acts of 1862 and 1890 to provide a, quote, practical education for the working classes by teaching agriculture, military tactics, and the mechanic arts, unquote. We are meeting in Bunch Hall, named after Ralph Bunche, who was a leader of the US Civil Rights Movement and the winner of the 1950 Nobel Peace Prize for his mediation between Palestinians and Israelis in the late 1940s. And that brings me to also acknowledge the political moment we are living, a context of expanding war in the Middle East, of finishing a year of tremendous suffering there, as well as in Ukraine, Russia, Sudan, never mind the climactic crisis we're seeing around the world, floods in West Africa, hurricanes in Thailand, North Carolina, Florida, and growing threats to democracy.
And the drying up of the Amazon.
Thank you. Yes, and I'm sure I left out many other places and spaces where suffering is happening, where crises are, where the world is at risk. So forgive me for not mentioning every place and every issue that is of concern to, should be of concern to all of us. But there are also some new possibilities emerging, some bright spots on the global stage, and we hope to hear a little bit of that and bring that into today's conversation. Today's panel is part of the International Institute's Generative Theme Initiative, centered on a triptych of important and potentially contentious concepts: democracy, freedom, and truth. The initiative is oriented to prompting reflection on what each of these terms means individually and in combination and dialogue with each other. The International Institute, for those of you who aren't familiar, we welcome you to peruse the website. There's also a web page about the Democracy, Freedom, and Truth Initiative. You can also sign up for our mailing lists and our monthly calendar. It brings together research centers and interdepartmental degree programs with people who have in-depth knowledge about many regions and matters in the world, but we often work in isolation. The aim of this panel and the aim of the Generative Themes Initiative is to generate conversation across regions, across this expertise, by considering what we can learn from looking at some of the many significant elections that have happened or that will soon happen around the world in 2024. The video from, I told you that, will be on the website, and if you don't want to be in the video, just don't sit in front of the camera. We've assembled 4 panelists, each of whom will speak briefly to important elections in different nations or regions of the world. We have India, Mexico, Latin America, and the European Union represented, and to the issues that these bring to the fore. We know these aren't all of the regions or elections that are happening in this year of super elections, but we want to invite conversation around these regions and others that you may be familiar with, and to think together, what can we learn from these and other electoral flashpoints around the globe during this moment, this current shifting world order, and in anticipation of the US elections next month. All right, so David, who went running out to look for our fourth panelist, is back, and he's going to introduce the speakers.
Thank you. Thank you, Marjorie. I would also like to begin by echoing her gratitude for all of you, not just being here, but also for your support. It's wonderful to have the chance of bringing everybody together. I stepped outside for a second because our fourth panelist, who is coming from outside of UCLA, is a little lost, but I hear that she's in the building. So hopefully she can make her way little by little and then join us in a minute. So let me begin by introducing you to the panelists. It's really my pleasure of doing so. Professor Susanna Hecht, to my right, is professor with several appointments at the Luskin School of Public Affairs and the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability at UCLA. She also serves as director of the Center for Brazilian Studies. She's proficient in numerous languages, and her publications focus on topics as far-reaching as migration, urbanization, the Amazon, and natural resources in South America. Professor Hecht will address three extremely dicey elections in countries that have Amazon sovereignties: Venezuela, poster country for election fraud, and that's also the country of my birth; Bolivia, with its staged auto coup, that's also the country where my wife is born; and Peru, no connection there. These are all flailing, if not failed states, but the implications for the capacity of governance over critical and large Amazonian areas has much broader effects at the level of local systems, climate change, and the rise of clandestine economies. Let me move then to her right and introduce Dr. Gaspar Rivera Salgado. Dr. Rivera Salgado is director of the UCLA Center for Mexican Studies and project director at the UCLA Labor Center and core faculty in the UCLA Labor Studies program. He directs the Global Labor Initiative with an emphasis on cross-border worker-to-worker collaborations between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. Dr. Rivera Salgado will address last June's landslide victory of Mexico's first female president, Claudia Sheinbaum. He will consider both the power Sheinbaum assumes with significant ability to pass constitutional reforms and the challenges she will face given complex political dynamics and endemic challenges in security and the rule of law in Mexico. Then we have our third panelist, Tejas Parasha. Professor Parasha is assistant professor of political theory with a joint appointment in the Department of Political Science and the International Institute. So he's one of our teaching faculty. He's the author of an award-winning book, Radical Democracy in Modern Indian Political Thought. It appeared with Cambridge University Press in 2023. His research explores the political philosophy of collective self-determination, political representation, and statehood. Last but not least, our final panelist has just joined us. We're so glad that you're here. And she is a visitor to UCLA. Professor Ulrike Klinger is a Thomas Mann Fellow this year, and she is professor and chair of digital democracy, as well as a member of the board of directors of the European New School of Digital Studies at the European University Viadrina in Frankfurt, Oder in Germany. Professor Klinger will discuss the new European Parliament that was elected in June 2024 in relation to the upcoming US election with a comparative perspective on democratic vulnerabilities, democratic backsliding, and safeguarding core democratic institutions. She brings a longitudinal perspective to consider the role of election campaigns on social media and both the success of far-right parties and divisions within them. So thank you once again for joining the panel. Let's give them, first of all, a round of applause. We have asked each panelist to speak for about 5 to 10 minutes and then jump right into a discussion. as soon as possible. The sooner the better, because I'm sure you will have lots of questions, and we very much look forward to the discussion. Thank you. So let's begin with Tejas. Please come forward.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So thank you, David, first of all, and to Marjorie, and both of you for organizing this important event, for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to discussing with you and with my co-panelists. So as I think both David and Marjorie mentioned at the beginning, this is a critically important year, even by the standards of what's been happening over the last 5 years. I mean, this is most obviously the year when the greatest number of human beings either have already gone to the polls or will be going to the polls collectively in human history. And what I want to do in my remarks is to look at the largest of these democratic exercises, which was the Indian parliamentary elections, which happened in April and May of 2024. I want to say a little bit about some dynamics that I observed or have observed in retrospect about these elections, and then use them to make some more general remarks about the relationship between, I think, democracy and liberalism and rights, and that kind of triangular relationship, because those aren't the same thing. And I think part of what the Indian election has shown me is that relationship is in some sort of moment of evolution. I'm not sure what it's heading towards, but there seems to be some kind of transformation happening in that kind of relationship. Okay, so what exactly happened? So in the 2024 general election in India, the incumbent, the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party, or BJP, led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, was expected to win a decisive victory. Right, this was the expectation going into the elections. And if you looked at polling numbers, including exit polls, into the early stages of the election in April, then the prediction was that the BJP would certainly get an absolute majority on its own. So just as a single party. So this would have meant that it would get at least 273 of the total 543 elected seats in the national parliament. So that was sort of the baseline prediction. And then further, the prediction was that it would actually beat the seat share that it had received in 2019, the 303 seat share that it had gained in the 2019 election. So the expectation was not that the BJP would win, not just that, but that it would do better than it had done 5 years earlier when it had won a clear landslide victory, right? It actually, in the lead up to the election, in the campaigning, BJP party leaders were pushing for more than 400 seats on its own as a party, which is something that has not happened in Indian history except once in 1984, right? So this would have meant a full-on supermajority win. Now, what happened? So this was the prediction going into the elections, and what happened? Well, in the end, the BJP did win the 2024 election. So it is the governing party today. And actually just this evening, it won elections in a crucial northern state. So it's still, it won. But its victory margin was substantially less than either party leaders or pollsters had predicted or anticipated. So on its own, the BJP only gained 240 seats, which is far less than what it had gained in 2019. And it only actually gained a majority through its coalition partners, right? So it had formed this coalition with other parties called the National Democratic Alliance, or the NDA. And that is what it's that coalition that led the BJP to form a majority. And even that majority, that absolute majority, was short of 300. So even as part of a coalition, it fell short of the single party, like, the votes it had gotten as a single party in 2019. And the party also lost some key constituencies in northern states where it had expected to sail to easy victory, right? So I think the victory of the BJP, the electoral victory of the BJP, was not surprising to anyone, but the fact that it happened through such slim margins did catch many people off guard. I don't know if anyone saw this video that went viral of a pollster crying on camera because he realized that his predictions had not come true. Yeah. Okay, so that's what happened. Now I think there have been a few, some of the commentary produced in the immediate aftermath of the election was a little too optimistic, too exaggerated, that saying that this marks the end of populism, the end of strongman politics. I don't think that's true. And as I said, the BJP just won in another election. So, it doesn't, I don't think it marks that kind of watershed moment of an end of a certain era that had started. But it is striking for a few other reasons. And there are a number of factors behind this result, right? So we can imagine things like regionalism, the importance of regionalism in Indian politics, the idea, the concern about welfare provisions, the reality of India's lagging growth, job growth numbers, and so on. So there were a number of factors, but one particularly important one that I want to just briefly highlight is a concern that had become very salient about the problem of constitutional erosion. Right, and this is a term that sometimes now become current in political and constitutional theory. So constitutional erosion, there was a real tangible fear in the early months of 2024 that if the BJP were to win through a supermajority vote, it would have unimpeded power to fundamentally amend the Constitution. Right. So the kind of parliamentary structure that had been put into place through this constitutional structure that has been more or less functioning seamlessly since 1950 would be threatened. Right. So this, while this was obviously a parliamentary election, there was a fear that it was the supermajority win of more than 400 would have given Modi almost unbridled executive power to amend the constitution. And this is something that has happened in India once before during a period called the emergency, right? This 2-year period in 1975, from 1975 to 1977. Where there was a real, interruption of democracy and a changing of the constitution. There was a fear that this was going to happen again. And what I think that one of the things that I just want to mention that was really striking to me, and has been even more striking as I kind of look back on this election, is that something that the otherwise shaky coalition of opposition parties did successfully was to highlight the election as a fight over the Constitution, over constitutional values. Right. And so the election came to be framed as an election for liberal rights, for a liberal vision of a division of powers, the sanctity of the judiciary and so on, but also for the protection of sort of basic civil liberties and individual rights. Right. And so this election became framed as an election for the values of constitutional liberalism, as much as or more than an election between different competing visions of nationalism, which is what I think the contest between the BJP and other parties had been through the 2010s, whether or not you imagine India to be a secular republic or not, whether or not you imagine what you imagine your vision of national security to be. I think much of the debate had been about nationalism. And what I'm really struck by is that in 2024, the debate seems to have shifted towards a defense of liberal values, sort of basic liberal, what we might call basic liberal values. So a lot of the rhetoric against the incumbent party was either framed as a defense of core constitutional values of the Constitution itself, or as an institutional defense of pluralist democracy, separation of powers, and individual rights, right? So there were lots of opposition rallies held through March, which were literally titled "Save the Constitution." Right? And copies of the Constitution became this kind of totemic symbol that people were holding up. And I think this is really new. I found this, as someone who works on the Indian Constitution in comparative perspective, I found this kind of mass uptake of a constitutional language of liberal rights to be very new, right? As I mentioned, it's different. It struck me as being quite different from how the debate between the BJP and its opponents had been happening since 2014, which was more about nationalism. But it was also different from the brief interruption of democratic politics in India in the mid-1970s, right, which I just mentioned earlier. So this period called the emergency, where martial law is put into place under emergency measures, and democracy is effectively suspended. There's lots of violations of civil liberties and so on. At this moment, if you look back to the documents produced and the kind of rhetoric, political discourse in the 70s, the critique of democracy, of the emergency of martial law, of emergency powers, was as a defense of democracy and popular sovereignty, right? The power of the people, that this is not a democratic act, right? And so what we need is a defense of democracy. We need more robust forms of democracy. It's a critique of kind of one-party rule. That doesn't seem to be happening now. the opposition to Modi, to the BJP in 2024 seems to be enveloped in this liberal language of freedom and individual rights, which is new to me. Like at least at the mass level, seems new to me as a dynamic in Indian politics. And I think this is where I just want to close. And I think this is something really interesting. Like something really interesting is happening, I think, both in the Indian case and I think more broadly, right? That first of all, in the Indian case, this kind of the growth of this kind of grassroots liberalism, right? That opposition to perceived erosion of democracy is actually framed not in the language of democracy itself, but in the language of individual rights, which is not a language that I think has really had resonance in Indian political discourse in much of the 20th century. So this is new. And then I think globally as well, what it really shows, I think it signals something that there's been this talk of the rise of something called illiberal democracy with reference to Hungary, a democracy that kind of doubles down on principles of popular sovereignty and charismatic leadership, but is deeply skeptical, critical, and even rejects rights frameworks and so on. And in opposition to illiberal democracy, I think the uptake of liberalism itself, this kind of reclamation of the language of liberalism by actors and political thinkers and activists who I think never really had much to do with liberalism. I mean, you see the Communist Party in India, for instance, coming out in defense of like liberal rights. And this is just such a, it's this kind of consensus around the value of constitutional liberalism, which I think is really new. So I think what this shows globally and in more kind of abstract ways is a very different argument for the electoral process, for the value of democracy, beyond more familiar arguments about ensuring accountable government, right? So it shows how we can view elections that are happening now as kind of contests over liberalism itself, contests over the value of individual rights, rather than simply, as I think we've tended to see them, as contests over democratic robustness of democratic institutions. That's usually how democratic backsliding and erosion have been seen. But I think there's something much deeper going on here that the Indian elections are a kind of indicator of, right? This kind of debate about whether liberalism itself needs to be protected in a democratic framework, and what are the stakes of doing that. So I'll stop there. I think there's a lot more I could say. There's a lot more I didn't say about these elections, but I'm hoping we can come back to some of these questions and connections in the conversation. So thank you.
Well, thank you for coming out here on a beautiful day where you might be happily sitting outside, having lunch outside. What I'm going to be talking about is perhaps, it sort of feels like the opposite of what we just heard, which is really the thinking about these questions, not so much within a national context, but within a regional context, and also within an environmental and planetary context, because I think it's important to understand that these elections really aren't just about us, although of course we feel it to be that way, but also about very important environmental questions. So in that light, I'd like to go forward and sort of think about what these kinds of ecological implications are of electoral failures and collapsologies, that is, tipping points and flashpoints in politics in many places of the world have very important environmental questions. And as we know, nobody escapes climate change anymore. So hang on to your hats. Okay, this is sort of a picture of the major climate tipping points, planetary climate tipping points. Now, if you look rather carefully, one of the things that you might notice is that most of these are not particularly inhabited. The West Antarctic ice sheet, teeming with its urban culture and, famous for its films. No, what you see is that most of the tipping points on climate, and they're very serious ones, by the way, are reflected in areas that aren't actually inhabited. So, but the one area that is really inhabited is Amazonia. It's got 40 million people. So in a sense, human agency, okay, we can do whatever we do with our cars and other kinds of things, but in terms of one of the great carbon engines of the planet, it is Amazonia at its heart. And it is a highly populated place, even though we have the green blob problem. Oh, nothing's there. It's just, you know, those, you see that map? So I'll show you. So let me just quickly go over what are the kind of the stakes, because I'm going to talk about failing states, failing democracies, and what that means in terms of the stakes for the planet, for the climate. As they say, well, I never knew climate change would happen so fast, but those of you who follow the Great Acceleration know that we're on an exponential drive, so you want to look out. So I'm going to try and break open the green blob for you a little bit and give you a bigger picture of what's going on. So one of the things is, okay, I showed you that picture and everybody's chewing their nails. Oh, these big climate tipping points. But what's at stake is when we look at Amazonia, what we see is a really important tipping point having to do with the climate engine, both the absorption from the atmosphere and the storage. And when you destroy it, you release a bunch of carbon. So there's that. And if you destabilize it so that the system itself can't reproduce itself, it starts to be an emitter of carbon itself. And we'll get to that later. The other thing, which you're probably more familiar with the question of carbon, but perhaps a lot less so with the importance of Amazonia as a hydrological driver in the climate and planetary system. So one of the things, of course, my usual obnoxious things, everybody leaves Amazonia out. It's the size of the United States. It's got, you know, a zillion of everything in it. But drying up a set of rivers that are 1/6 of the world's fresh water is not nothing. And I myself keep finding myself extremely distressed at looking at the drying of the Amazon, because of course, this has major effects more generally. And these, I've just mentioned a few of the major tributaries, doesn't matter to go through those here. But so we have the rivers on the ground, but we also have what are called aerial rivers. Now we in here know that we get aerial rivers. That's where we get our big horrific storms that come smashing in at us. There are these aerial rivers that are generated by the Amazon itself. And I'll show you a picture in a minute. But they're the key to rain-fed agriculture in the rest of the hemisphere, in the rest of the southern hemisphere. So what you have to sort of imagine is if you interfere with those aerial rivers, you interfere with the hydrological and watering system for much of the important agricultural areas of the planet. This is also important for shipping. There's the ecological thing of rivers, livelihoods, and shipping. So, and water. In 2014, Sao Paulo ran out of water. It was, of course, another one of these sort of failures of the aerial river. The other thing is, although we might not care about it that much, you might not be familiar with the Pantanal. I have great pictures, but I don't have any time to put them up. It is sort of the New World Serengeti. It's the world's largest wetland, and about half of it burned this year. So it's, and in the previous bout, a couple of years ago, something like 17 million vertebrates killed in the process of drying out and burning up a wetland. So you want to really think about the magnitude and the scale of what political processes can unleash or can curtail. So this is an extremely important repeating point that I'll be making. I have a paper that just came out on what else, my Valentine to Amazonia with a bunch of other colleagues about the Amazon hitting its tipping point. That is, if it gets cleared enough, it becomes unstable, and then it turns into a different kind of vegetation. Now, we don't normally think about that as going on, but processes occur without our intervention. So this is also and we're really coming close to that tipping point, which is again, why it's important to think about what political actors and actions and capacities in governance mean in terms of larger questions that are related to our lives, but perhaps we don't think about them quite that way. The other thing is those aerial rivers affect Andean glaciers, Andean snowfall, and essentially are key to a lot of the hydrology of the Andean states. And then, of course, more generally, the questions of livelihoods of both urban and rural and other kinds of dynamics. So the stakes are really big on Amazonian governance. It's not just like, well, like maybe we'll lose a pupfish or something. It's really like losing continental level ecosystems. So here's I'm just going to give you sort of a look at this. What you can see here is I'm trying to break open the green blob for you. And what you can see is when we talk about Amazonian as a biome and not just like, Brazilian Amazon or something, what you can see is an important element of shared sovereignty of this area. And I think we have the habit of saying, well, it's all in Brazil. A lot of it really is. But you can sort of see this, that there are these little, the percent of the biome is kind of small. And, like, why should we care about Ecuador? It's only got 1.1%. But the point is that in terms of their national areas, they're quite extensive. That is, each of these countries has sovereignty over a big, has its national sovereignty, its national area is in the Amazon biome. So that the decisions it makes for its national good have lots of impacts that we might not expect them to have. So it's very important to understand that there are competing different dynamics that go on this that have different kinds of effects. So even though it looks small, and remember, it's big. Amazon, to quote George Bush when he discovered that Brazil is big, and not to quote a previous president either, I was worrying about certain kinds of sizes, but the point is Amazonia is really big, so that even though if you only have a fairly small percentage of it, what you do in terms of your decision making becomes a problem. Now, I'm just going to give you a picture of the drying Amazon, these sort of heartbreaking things. These aerial rivers, this is kind of what this looks like. The Amazon sort of sucks water out of it's more complicated than I'm going to explain, but basically sucks water out of the atmosphere and out of the ground and through various kinds of water convections. And it creates its own water system. This little diagram gives you a better sense of it. But the point that you can see here is that the hydrological system is largely a function of this biotic pump known as the Amazon forest. So even though we know that there have been large populations in the past, their dynamics of civilization were somewhat different from ours, which did not require the massive destruction of the forest itself. There's many interesting stories to be told about this, but I don't have time. So one of the things is when you start to deforest a lot and you have larger climate change, that the area becomes quite vulnerable to forest. And I think you can get a sense here of a kind of exploding dynamic. I'll talk more about these questions later, but let me just sort of make a premise describe a graph that gives you kind of a premise about where we are and why I'm going to make the argument I am. And again, it's more complicated than we can say in the time that we have. And I'm going to really have to zip. But what you see is that when you have actual governance and this period to my right, your left, is the period in which there was quite a bit of careful governance, a lot of transformations that went on. This is the first, the second Lula period. You go through, you start to see a little instability. This is during the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff and the Temer regime. And then in 2019, you get the entrance of Jair Bolsonaro. So you go, this is kind of one of those perfect social science experiments where you go, okay, we'll have management governance, we'll implement what we say our laws, we'll enforce them, and you get that kind of dynamic. And then you have the perfect alternative, which is Jair Bolsonaro says, let it rip. And then you see the deforestation dynamic like that. And then we have now, the Lula thing comes back, decline in deforestation. But now there's another dynamic going on, which has to do with, that is beyond the control of humans, which is the dynamics of desiccation and burning. But the point that I'm making here, which you should take away, the takeaway is lots, governance and management and enforcement of policies and local support as well, versus pulling everything off and having it be a laissez-faire system. Well, here's what you get. We have, I'm not going to go into too much detail here because I don't have very much time. Basically, what this slide will tell you is that there's a lot of explosive activities, a lot of expansion of illegal activities, that is illegal cultivation of coca, illegal mining, illegal timber, a lot of land grabbing and so on. And most of this becomes unregulated over time. And global demand for all of these is very high too, for reasons of different kinds of instabilities. So it's important to understand that this also is reflecting an expansion in clandestine economies. And also with clandestine economies, you also get a lot of criminal organizations. So the governance sort of shifts from what we might call collective state level governance and local governance into criminal organizations. Oops. So let me go through quickly, and I'm really going to zoom because I'm going to try and do this in 3 minutes. What we have is basically a bunch of failed states now who own and have sovereignty over a large amount of Amazonia. One, Ecuador, as you may have recalled, is now in a state of exception. It was on the verge of becoming a narco state. It is not really a democratic state anymore, even though it's going to have elections next year. And you get an overriding of what were actual things, such as the initiative to leave the oil in the ground in the Yasuni. And this has simply been overturned. So in that sense, the state of exception permits both a kind of militarization and criminalization of various kinds of state, how should we call it, those resisting the state, as well as those who can benefit from it. And also there's always a little bit of an alliance going on this. Many of you might have noticed this summer that Bolivia seemed to have an auto coup. Mr. Fujimori, who sort of invented the concept in Peru, just recently died. But basically there was an attempted coup, and as the leader of the coup was confronted, he said, no, he wanted to do this to get his numbers up. So in essence, we have a kind of a big problem. And then there is the larger problem of a kind of divided populism going on between in Bolivia between Evo Morales and Luis Arce, and a great deal of how should we say, the undermining and questioning the legitimacy of the governments. There's a lot more detail to this in terms of how the state itself was dismantled, and also the continuing conflict between the Santa Cruz, the lowland Amazonian elites, and the upland historical elites. So in any case, it's a flailed or a failed state. And in essence, it hasn't got a operating Amazonian management system. Venice, I'm gonna, I could just say a few words about Peru. Peru has a habit kind of deposing its presidents and dissolving its congresses. Currently, Dina Boluarte, who you might have been following, was famous for her collection of Rolexes. If you think they cost $10,000, that's only a fraction of what they cost. But as she was put into place, as Pedro Castillo was arrested, there were major massacres of street protests and so on. And again, there's a legitimacy crisis, a failing state, and essentially no Amazonian management, even though it has an expanding gold system. And Venezuela, of course, is the sort of poster child for maybe not a failed state, but a fully authoritarian state. Even though rivals were jailed, they were sent into exile, protesters were jailed and killed, it is also in some kind of crisis. Essentially, it's become also part of the narco nexus in Amazonia, illegal gold mining. The Arco Minero is basically run by former ELN revolutionaries and the military, and this is taking place in conservation areas. Okay, I'm going to just show you a few slides. Just trust me on this, that deforestation rates are going up with the kind of chaos that we're seeing. You can get some volatility, but overall the trend is very much up. And I don't want to go over this in too much detail, but it's easy to see deforestation. It's less easy to see this dynamic of illegal mining, particularly gold mining. And I'm going to just shoot through this because I'm right to the end here. This is what it looks like. When you look at this, it looks like little popcorn, but when you look at it on the ground, it's much more intense. And of course, the problem here is the issue of mercury toxicity of the rivers and of the airs and soil. And this is also what it looks like. When we start to move into questions of tipping points, what you see is in the pasture and agriculture and gold areas, we start to push Amazonia right to the tipping point, which is supposed to be about 20%. So again, I'm just leaping through this like a little gazelle. And this area here is the area which has now become an emitter of carbon rather than an absorber of it. It's in the Eastern Amazon. Another thing that's important to keep in mind, and you probably don't have this on your radar particularly, is that Amazonia is sort of the next major oil world. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but you can see also that in the Eastern Amazon, in the sort of Caribbean Amazon, this has now essentially become client states of oil companies. So, and I'm going to show you something. It also goes further down, but you probably didn't have Guyana on your radar as one of the major oil producers, non-OPEC oil producers. It's ahead of Norway. I can guarantee if you went to Guyana, you would not mistake it for Norway in terms of its social investments. So you might ask where that investment goes. And I think the Swiss banks might have a few words to say about this. But the point being that you're not seeing a lot of investment, but you are seeing some money laundering and various kinds of deforestation dynamics. I'm just finishing up. And the other thing is that not only are you seeing sort of, how shall we say, cartel economies, but also criminal groups that are running it. So within the context of these failed states and flailing states that are sitting distant from the Amazon, clinging to power and their own little interests in the dynamics, it has left a political void. It has left a governance void. And as we know, nature abhors a vacuum, and that vacuum is now increasingly filled by criminal groups, also with multinational links to European dynamics as well. So the great Brazilian writer Euclides da Cunha, of whom my little heart beats all the time, when he went through Amazonia a little more than 100 years ago, described it as the last unfinished page of Genesis, the place in which the world was being rewritten in this kind of marvelous and is illuminating way of abundance and glory. But it may be that the last unfinished page of Genesis looks more like this last slide. So thank you so much.
I really appreciate these last two presentations. Things are coming into perspective, right? And one of the questions that I wanted to address was how people organize the multiple paths to democracy, right? And who are the main actors there? This is a very interesting year for those of us who do US-Mexico relations. We have presidential elections on both countries, right? We had Mexican elections in June in Mexico, and in the United States, they're coming up in less than a month. So it's fascinating trying to explain the two systems to people, especially if you get interviewed by TV channels, because they want you to do it in 3 minutes, for example. And so, and this is a lesson on contrast, right? Whereas in the United States, you have re-elections, you have two parties. There have been attempts to have more than two parties, but basically the political scene is dominated by two parties. You can get reelected, and the country is split into half, right? The red and blue state. So what's little known is how Mexico organizes their elections. There are 7 national parties. I don't know if you knew that, but also you cannot get reelected. In Mexico, you get only 1 term, although that has been opened up for especially people in Congress. And of course, the headlines was that a woman was elected in June for the first time in the 200 years of Republican history in Mexico. And it was interesting too because she was competing with another woman. So Claudia Sheinbaum came out top against Xochitl Gálvez. So it was known already that a woman would be the president of Mexico in the June election. And one of the questions that people ask is, how did that happen, right? How is it that Mexico was able to elect a woman? And of course, being a woman, what are the challenges that she's facing? Everybody's interested about, of course, how she would deal with Donald Trump administration in November, right? Because we had a little preview of the last Trump administration dealing with the past president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. And so this is a history, I think, of political transitions. I would argue that there had been a big political transition in Mexico, especially along these lines of the political actors, which are political parties. Despite the fact that there were 7 national parties, these parties cluster alongside 3 main candidates. So they had to form coalitions. And it was fascinating to see these coalitions at work and also deploy a set of narratives to capture the attention and the loyalty of people. So, and this is a story also of a new party emerging and becoming dominant in a very short period of time. The political party of Claudia Sheinbaum is called Morena, Movimiento de Renovación Nacional, a movement of national renovation, which is very interesting. I mean, the acronym sounds better than the full name, Morena. And it was the first election that they participated was in 2014. There in the midterm election of the past administration, that was the first election. Then the 4 years later, in 2018, that was the first presidential election that Morena participated, and Andrés Manuel López Obrador won the presidency. They assembled together a coalition that you would call the center of left coalition with the Green Party, the Workers' Party, and Morena. So that's the coalition that also allow Claudia Sheinbaum to go to win the presidency. The other coalition is kind of a mixture. I don't know how you call it, because you have the PRD which is the legacy Communist Party of Mexico. It had gone through many different transformations, but the PRD was that party that represented the left in Mexico, which became only legal in the late 1970s. And the last transformation of that party was to convert into the PRD. Then we had the PRI, the party that governed Mexico since the aftermath of the Mexican Revolution up to the transition in the 1990s with the Center Folk. So it was a center nationalist party. The PRI was always it was hard to classify. They were part of the International Socialists. They were very nationalistic. They knew how to fix elections, so that's why they were named like the perfect dictatorship. And then you have the PAN, the Actional National Party, which is the left, the right to center party. So you had that coalition. So at the end, in this second presidential election for Morena, Claudia Sheinbaum won in a landslide. It wasn't even close, 30% more than the next candidate. So it was interesting. But these elections also were very consequential. The entire Congress, the 500 federal representatives and the entire Senate, 128, were up for grabs. So that's interesting. So the big political debate was very localized, really. It was a continuation, a candidate, Claudia Sheinbaum, whose main message was that she wanted to continue with the policies, the populist policies of Andrés Manuel López Obrador. And the opposition, that they really tried to figure out how to frame that, right? That I don't know if you remember the election of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, but they said, if he wins, Mexico is going to become a Venezuela because he's basically a leftist, reckless candidate, and our democracy is going to go down the drain. That didn't happen. They tried to really come up with a narrative about a fight for democracy in Mexico. And this is interesting because Andrés Manuel López Obrador, in the last year, he's been proposing major reforms in Mexico. And he's a very interesting character. He left office with 70% approval rate of the electorate. This is just quite astonishing, right? That a president that governed the country for 6 years was such a dominant political figure that he left office with such high approval rate. And in the last month, the elections happened in June, the new Congress, with a new composition where the Morena party with its allies controlled a supermajority in the House of Representatives. And they were one senator shy of controlling 2/3 of the Senate, actually. In this last month, there have been about 7 constitutional reforms in Mexico, major reforms. And they were passed because Morena was able to gain 1 senator from the PAN to vote on these major reforms. So these elections were very consequential because in this last month, and that was before the new president election, but came into office on October 1st, the transition had been shortened. It used to be that the new president would come into office in December, but that the summer and the fall, that was a long time. So they decided to shorten that. So the new Congress started session in September, and the president took office on October 1st. So it was quite astonishing to be in Mexico City. Just walking towards the Zócalo, the main plaza where Claudia Sheinbaum will receive in symbolic ways the staff of leadership, Bastón de Mando, with surrendered by 120 women actually on stage as a symbol of women representation, indigenous people representation, and it was a massive mobilization. So I was thinking, what an interesting way. The elections would settle a lot of debate, right? The elections were not even close. The Morena won by a landslide, but still there's a lot of questions coming up, and especially thinking about the relationship between US and Mexico, there are some major questions, right? First of all, what's going to happen in the US election? That's going to be very interesting because, of course, analysts are saying that, there might be one scenario where with Kamala Harris, there might be some openings to figure out multilateral solutions to a lot of the problems that US-Mexico are facing. Then not only is violence, narcotrafficking, it's also the waves of immigrants coming from Central America, South America, but also other parts of the world. Now they're coming through Mexico and staying in Mexico. So that would require not a unilateral solution, but really sitting down with a lot of these countries in Central America, the US, and Mexico. The new trade agreement that has been the framework that has allowed Mexico to become the first trading partner of the United States is up for a renegotiation. They have to come up with a new version of the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement by 2026, in 2 years. So that's going to be the first order of business, really, for the new for this new administration in Mexico, but also for the US administration. Assemble a negotiating team and come up with a new version of the US-Canada-Mexico trade agreement that has had a tremendous impact in terms of the Mexican economy. The last agreement that was signed at the end of 2019 really literally forced Mexico to do and to start anew its labor legal framework. They had to come up with new structures, with a new federal legal system, and that was good for a lot of workers, right? I mean, that provided with the emergence of an independent labor movement. But now it has to be renegotiated. There's a lot of questions on posting this trade agreement, especially energy, food production, and especially drug trade. So those are big issues that are going to be there. And actually, I think some of the issues is, people are questioning, and people have a lot of questions about whether or not the reforms that are happening in Mexico are sustainable and are good for democracy. And I think we need to pay attention to that. The most controversial reform that was approved was the judicial reform, and the party in power actually proposed, and that was approved, that the Supreme Court and a lot of the judges are going to be elected on a popular vote. That is a source of a lot of controversy. Clearly, the international press was totally against that. They advised, and the U.S. ambassador in Mexico, Ken Salazar, got into a lot of trouble because he came out in a press conference speaking against those reforms, and before the Secretary of Mexico complained about that, and there was a huge backlash internationally, thinking that maybe that's not a good reform. From the perspective of the outgoing president, he mentioned that there was a lot of corruption, and the only way to fix it, to stop elites for controlling the judicial system, was for people to vote. Of course, Morena is riding a popular wave. It may be these Supreme Court justices are going to be elected. Of course, Morena would win maybe in the short term. But what if that changes, right? Maybe the political winds can change, and who knows what's going to happen. So that's one example of the major transformation that are happening in Mexico. And there were other big also changes in the constitution. But I think keeping in mind the large picture, I think that these elections, the fact that Morena has consolidated, the fact that that's a new political party, which is very interesting, right? How a new political party can so quickly become so dominant. And I think this is one of the questions also. Can you be too successful in a democracy for your own good? And that's what people are afraid in Mexico, right? Because we had experience with another political party that was so dominant for 75 years, the PRI. Basically, they run the country and there was no opposition. So are we running the risk to really go back to that framework where a party is so dominant that, you know, they don't have to negotiate, they don't have to really care about the process of deliberation because they have the majority in Congress and they're writing a very populist vote. So I think those are sort of some issues that we can think about. And also the fact, gender, I think that's another important thing. How did it happen that a woman was elected president? And I think one thing that we need to think about is it wasn't like all of a sudden Claudia Sheinbaum emerged into the public scene. There had been reforms in Mexico, especially the reforms of gender parity, not equity, parity. The electoral system in Mexico demanded that all parties issue a slate of candidates equally along gender lines, 50 and 50%. So this is the first election in which that provision was fully in place. And it has transformed the elections in Mexico. Half of Congress, half of the House of Representatives and House of the Senate are women. The cabinet of Claudia Sheinbaum is 50% women and 50% male. So that is very interesting. That is mandated by reforms in the electoral system. Claudia Sheinbaum, of course, she is a well-known politician in Mexico. She was the governor of Mexico City. And in the old days, this is another very interesting thing for those of us who work in public university, she was a leader in the student movement in the 1990s. That's how she burst in the public scene in the large movement against the increased tuition in Mexico City. So she's been around for quite a while. But I think that reform that demanded parity between men and women in all political positions has made such a tremendous impact. And it was a process. It's been a long 20-year-long process of instituting that. And you see the results here. So thank you so much.
Okay, hello, and thank you so much, Marjorie and David, for organizing this. It's really important that although we're all looking forward and we're excited about the US election, we're, keeping an eye on what's happening in those other 60 plus elections, or at least some of them are happening in the world. So I'm going to bring to the table some insights from the European Parliament elections that took place in June. Just some parts that I find interesting, some trends, some open questions. Of course, there are lots of other things we can discuss here. I learned that there is faculty in the room, people who might know more about the EP elections than I do, but there are also first-year students in the room. So to start out with a little bit of a background, why are the European Parliament elections so interesting? Well, they give us a good starting point to compare election campaigns in European countries, because all of those 27 member states have vastly different political systems, different media systems, different political cultures. So when they do their national elections for national governments, national parliaments, it's really difficult to compare, let's say, Austria to Sweden, for instance, or Germany and Poland. But in the European Parliament election, everyone votes at the same time, roughly the same day, according to the same systems, and we can really compare how parties or politicians campaign across countries. The EU elections are pretty big and relevant. So we have 27 member countries. That makes 450 million people who live there, an electorate of 375 million eligible voters. That's the second largest democratic electorate in the world after India. It's a pretty big parliament with 720 seats, and who gets the seat also has some relation to the population size in the member countries, not just the parties that run there. So we can say it's the largest simultaneous transnational elections that we have in the world. And this is happening every 5 years since 1979. Which is why it's so rare that we have European elections in the same year with US elections that are held every 4 years. very different election cycle. And the principle behind the European Parliament and the national parliaments is subsidiarity. So the idea is Europe when it's necessary, national when it's possible. So there are some policy fields that the European Parliament has the power to discuss and decide. That's things like customs and trade agreements or currency, like our common currency, the euro. There are shared powers when it comes to agriculture, energy, research, and science and these things. And then there are things that the national governments and sometimes regional governments and parliaments get to decide, things like education, culture, defense, and these things. So we have European parties, but it's largely the national parties that run the campaigns for the European Parliament elections. And then after the election, the parties form blocs, basically party groups in the European Parliament that are basically like factions that work together, and that you can see here. And the interesting thing I wanted to point out here, and that's the first trend I wanted to bring to the table today, is how very strong the far right has been in these past elections this year. So by now, 1/4, 25% of the seats in the European Parliament are in the hands of far-right parties. In France, the far-right came at first, 30%, which led Emmanuel Macron to dissolve the national parliament and call for snap elections. Whether that was super smart or not is a different discussion. In Germany, the far-right came in second with 15%, also super strong. So now they're like 25% of the European Parliament. However, they are not united. So we now have 3 groups that are all far right, but they're not united in one party group in parliament. So we have the Patriots for Europe. That's a party with, for instance, Viktor Orban's Fidesz party from Hungary, the Austrian FPÖ in there. We have the Europe of the Sovereign Nations. That's basically only the German AfD, because nobody wanted to be together with them anymore for reasons I'll just come to. And we have the ECR faction here. There you will find the Fratelli d'Italia, Giorgia Meloni's party, or the Polish Peace Party. So those are all far-right parties, but they're not necessarily friends with each other. And one reason for that, especially for the isolation of the German AfD, is that their leading candidate, Maximilian Krah, was really, he's a really scandalous figure. He was embroiled in all kinds of scandals, Chinese espionage, close connections to Russia. But most importantly, briefly before the election, he gave an interview in Italy, and he really played down the role of the SS and the Nazi regime. And it's just his inability to kind of distance themselves or deal in any meaningful way with the Nazi past of Germany that really causes this isolation of the German AfD within the far right in Europe. And here's a comment by a German influencer in a very satirical way, obviously, who commented this kind of being kicked out. So Marine Le Pen in France said she will not be in a parliament group with AfD, and then Giorgia Meloni seconded that. So this influencer hot, so he commented, see, when it comes to far-right extremisms, we Germans needn't worry. Our far-right extremists are too extreme for the other far-right extremists. So yeah, we can still do it. So obviously a satirical comment, but I think really nails it what happened there. Another trend, and somehow connected to that, is the rise of negativity in campaigning. And I only can show you empirical data for the EU elections in 2014 and 2019, because for this year, we're still analyzing the data. So this is from a Facebook post of political parties in 2 weeks before the election day. For those 2 years, we analyzed 120 party, but 15,000 posts in 11 or 12 countries, so not all of them. And the dotted line is 2019. The black line is 2014. And you can see negative emotions were up in 2019. Negative campaigning, meaning saying not, vote for us, we're great, but don't vote for them. It's the end of the world. They're super bad. is populist content. Dramatization is also on the rise. And this has not only to do with the far right or, the usual suspects, but we saw in 2019, it's also conservative parties who are increasingly picking up those narratives. Why? Because they benefit on social media from this. They get so much more engagement. And that's something we can show in this paper, that, the way social media, especially Facebook, is built around user engagement, they really, really benefit from negativity. And some European parties have also complained to Meta that the platforms incentivize them to go more and more negative when this is not a way they actually want to talk to voters and potential voters. So we'll see if this has continued this year. By end of October, I have data, but I would very much expect it to. Another more of an open question than a trend is the phenomenon of election denialism. And of course, you are well aware of this. There has been a lot of those false claims of election fraud. Of course, if there is election fraud, one has to be very open and upfront about it, but those false claims to kind of undermine the trust in electoral institutions. And my question is if this is sort of seeping also into the European discourses, if we see more of this in the EU. I remember the very first paper I ever wrote was about López Obrador and his claims of fraud in 2006 when he blocked the entire Paseo de la Reforma. So I kind of circling back to election denialism here. There are some examples here from Germany, from some regional elections we just had a couple of weeks back, where you can see similar claims, like we know from the US. Politicians who say they will only accept the result if they like it, and calling for their supporters to kind of volunteer to monitor the counting of votes and all of these things, kind of making them aware that there will be fraud, especially mail-in ballots, super fraudulent, presumably. So we see some of that, probably not as much as in the US, but I'm very curious. And again, at end of October, we're lagging a bit behind with this project, unfortunately, so I can't give you any numbers. Right here. So what is interesting when we compare this with the US, as I said, it's a really large and big election, EU parliament election. But the US are actually pretty much an outlier system with their political system, and perhaps the EU election is also an outlier because it's a transnational election. But I think one thing we definitely have in common is the vulnerability of our elections, of election campaigns when it comes to disinformation campaigns, the role of AI, the potential of seeing more and more deepfakes made with AI this year, of course, and in the future. So far, there is more anecdotal evidence, especially from voices from an election in Slovakia last fall. There have been some disinformation campaigns kind of mirroring real existing media websites, but just changing the URL a little bit, that you can have lots of false information on there, but people actually think they are on the website of a trusted news site. Some sort of deepfakes, but no real big campaigns that could really kind of swing an election or anything like that. Now we could say perhaps we are lucky so far, but I think, again, with election denialism, we have to look more to the past campaigns and see especially how this connects with claims of presumed election fraud. If there is no election fraud happening, but you claim there is, you kind of need evidence. And then the ability of creating images and videos through prompts in AI, stuff, ballot boxes and stuff like that comes in very handy. So the question in the US and in Europe is, how can we safeguard our campaigns, but still maintain freedom of speech? We see that US voters are worried about AI and the upcoming elections. We also see that the platforms are responsible to kind of taking care of that and mitigating their collateral effects. We do have some regulation in Europe that you do not have here in the US. Oh, there it is. The Digital Services Act was passed last year, the AI Act. And one thing that's interesting about the Digital Services Act is that it forces platforms to give us some reports, some transparency. So this is what's going on X, for instance. They were asked how many, like, what are the language capabilities of your content moderators in Europe? So we see they don't have a lot of content moderators, 2000 something. They had one person that spoke Dutch. Let's say that from 2023, there was a national election in the Netherlands. There's one person that speaks Polish, 81 that speak German. Wow, great. So you see, they're not really taking this seriously. Just if you look at the number of language capabilities of content moderators, that is very much speaking for itself. What we also do have in common is that for scholars and independent monitoring institutions, it's next to impossible to really monitor what's going on social media platforms in election campaigns these days, because the data access was always bad. It has become even worse in the past years and months. So again, the Digital Services Act in the EU is a little silver line on the horizon, because it contains one article, Article 40, that gives scholars for the first time legal right to access platform data for certain kinds of research questions when they connect to high-risk things in the union. If you want to know more about this, I run a research project that's kind of tracking the application scholars send to platforms. If you apply for access, do they get an answer? Is the answer yes or no? And like, what's the reasoning there? And also doing some advisory work for policymakers on how to implement data access. So if you're struggling with this, also we're trying to figure out how this can be useful for US scholars, not just for European scholars. Yeah, talk to me. And I'm stopping here, so we still have some time for discussion. Thank you.
Wow. Well, there was quite a wealth of information, different perspectives from the discursive, the narrative level, to the symbolic, cultural, the environmental impacts, the material impacts, economic impacts of these elections that we're seeing. We want to have some time for you to talk, but before we invite questions in, could you at least just turn to each other, turn to someone near you and say, what do you kind of take away? What's some big takeaway from this, or some question that you have? Let's spend 1 minute talking with each other, and then we'll take whatever time we have left before people come into the room.
That's a good idea. Like, that's the norm in seminars. That's really opposite.